All right, so if you're into urban planning these days, like we are, you've probably heard about the Kigali Master Plan.
Oh, yeah, it's getting a lot of buzz, especially that 2050 vision.
Right. We're going deep on this one, folks, into the zoning regulations themselves.
Yeah, think of it as the rule book for how Kigali wants to grow over the next few decades.
And this isn't just some dusty old document.
No, this was created by a whole team.
Yeah, a whole bunch of urban planners,
Transport experts,
engineers,
all those folks.
all working together to make Kigali a model city for all of Africa.
And I think what's so fascinating about this particular plan is how it really tries to face head-on some of the huge challenges that cities are dealing with all over the world today.
Yeah, it's way more than just zoning, you know?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about
It's about creating a city that's inclusive and sustainable and resilient.
We're talking mixed-use zoning, pedestrian-first design, and even this program called Transfer of Development Rights.
Ooh, that sounds interesting.
This could be a good one.
Yeah, this is definitely not just about buildings and roads. It's about people.
Exactly.
So where do we even start with a plan this ambitious? Like, what's the main goal here?
Well, Kigali's vision is all about inclusivity. They really want to make a city that works for everybody, not just a select few.
Makes sense.
And to do that, it means creating a really diverse city, supporting small businesses as well as those big investors, and making sure that there are affordable housing solutions.
So it's a city that kind of grows and changes with its people.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so that's the big picture I'm getting at. But how does that actually translate into, like, real actions on the ground?
That's where these planning principles come in.
Okay.
They're like the guiding lights of the whole plan.
All
And
right.
one of the key principles that they highlight is integrated development and urban resiliency.
Okay.
So they're designing a city that can adapt to change, whether it's,
Climate change,
population growth,
economic shifts.
all of that,
Yeah, resilience is definitely a big deal these days. But a city is so much more than just its buildings and infrastructure.
Oh, absolutely.
It's about the people who live there.
100%. And that's why another one of their core principles is inclusivity and community involvement.
Okay, I like that.
And this is where things get really, really interesting.
How so?
Because Kigali is taking a bottom-up approach.
Interesting.
They're actually incorporating feedback from local stakeholders.
So it's not just a top-down plan.
Not at all. It's built with the community in mind.
Wow. So they're actually listening to the people who live and work in Kigali.
Yeah, they're really trying to avoid that whole build it and they will come mentality.
That makes a lot of sense.
Another principle that they emphasize is incrementality and flexibility,
Okay.
which basically means that this plan can evolve over time.
Makes sense.
They recognize that a city is a living thing,
Yeah.
and this plan needs to be able to breathe and adapt along with it.
Right.
So how do they find that balance between flexibility and, actually having a solid plan? One way they do that is through this principle of mixed land use.
Okay.
So they're encouraging a blend of residential, commercial, and public facilities in most areas.
Interesting.
So you don't end up with these isolated zones for, just living or just working or just shopping.
Right.
Imagine a city where you can walk to work, grab your groceries, and then meet up with friends all in your own neighborhood.
That sounds lovely, actually.
That's the kind of vibrant, walkable city they're aiming for.
Yeah, I'm starting to get the picture here.
Good.
It's about creating a city that feels more human, more connected somehow.
Exactly.
More walkable, like you said.
Yeah, and to double down on that, they have this principle of pedestrian first.
I like that.
So they're prioritizing walking and cycling over cars,
Pretty bold.
which is a bold move in a world that's still so car-centric.
Yeah, it is.
But they're thinking about tree-lined streets, bike lanes, pedestrian plazas,
Ooh, I love a good pedestrian plaza.
designed to make walking and cycling not just possible, but enjoyable.
Imagine that, right? A city where you don't have to battle traffic every single day.
It's a game changer.
That's a whole different lifestyle.
For sure.
But how do you make that work in a city that's still, developing and growing so rapidly?
Well, they're thinking long-term. They're embracing this concept called transit-oriented development,
Okay.
which basically means concentrating development around public transportation hubs.
Interesting.
So it's kind of like creating these mini cities within the city,
Okay.
all connected by a really robust public transit system.
So it's all connected.
Exactly. And that reduces reliance on cars and makes it easier for people to get around without contributing to all that traffic congestion.
Smart thinking.
And of course, we have to talk about the environmental impact of all this development.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Absolutely. And that's where the principle of sustainable design comes into play.
Okay.
They're mandating environmentally friendly practices in building design and construction.
So that includes things like energy efficiency, water conservation using sustainable materials,
All of that.
building a city that's beautiful and functional, but also, easy on the planet.
Exactly.
Like it's a holistic approach.
It is, or thinking about all these interconnected aspects of city life.
So these principles sound amazing in theory, but how do they actually manifest, like in the city's layout?
That's where those zoning regulations come in.
Okay.
They've divided Kigali into all these different zones, each with its own set of rules and regulations that are specifically designed to achieve those big goals.
Okay, let's unpack some of those zones.
Let's do it.
What are some of the key categories they've created?
Well, they have a really wide range, from residential to commercial, industrial, public facilities,
Okay.
and even these special zones for protecting natural resources.
So they thought of pretty much everything.
Yeah, they've been very thorough.
So walk me through it. What kind of zones are we talking about here?
Well, let's start with the residential zones, since that's where most people are going to be living and experiencing the city.
Okay, makes sense.
And they have this whole spectrum of residential zones ranging from low-density areas with single-family homes to high-density areas with apartment buildings.
Okay.
And they very carefully considered the density targets for each zone to make sure that they create a really diverse and balanced urban fabric.
So it's not just a one-size-fits-all approach to housing.
Not at all. They're trying to accommodate all those different lifestyles and income levels.
Yeah.
And they want to encourage that mix of housing types to create those vibrant, walkable neighborhoods we were talking about.
I like it.
So that's residential.
Okay, what about the places where people work and shop?
For that, they have mixed-use zones, which are specifically designed to foster those vibrant, live work-play environments.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine living above your favorite coffee shop.
Oh, that's the dream.
Or having a co-working space right around the corner from your apartment.
Perfect.
That's the kind of energy they're aiming for.
That's awesome. It's all about creating that sense of community and convenience. What about those essential services, like schools, hospitals, parks?
Oh, they've got those covered too, with public facility zones.
Okay.
Strategically located throughout the city.
So everyone has access.
Exactly.
Right.
And they haven't forgotten about green spaces either.
Wrong.
They have dedicated zones for parks and open spaces to preserve those vital natural areas.
Good. So they're thinking about the well-being of the people and the environment.
Absolutely. And they're not shying away from those realities of industrial development either.
Right. Every
What?
city needs that.
Exactly. So they have these industrial zones that are specifically designed for manufacturing and production.
Okay.
But they've carefully considered that environmental impact.
Right.
And they've implemented these really strict regulations to make sure those industries operate sustainably.
So it's not just about attracting any business. It's about attracting the right businesses.
Exactly. The ones that align with those sustainability goals.
Good.
And to add another layer of nuance to this whole zoning system, they've incorporated these really fascinating things called overlay zones.
Ooh, overlay zones. Those sound intriguing.
Think of them as these additional layers of regulations that are applied to very specific areas to address particular issues or opportunities.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. One example is the neighborhood commercial zone overlay,
Okay.
which is all about encouraging those small businesses and retail within residential zones.
Oh, so like those corner stores and things.
Exactly, but only within a certain distance from major roads.
So it's strategic.
Exactly.
So you have that convenience without, disrupting the residential character of the neighborhood.
Exactly.
Okay, so they're being really strategic about where those businesses can pop up.
Yeah, they have a whole range of other overlays too, from slope overlays for regulating development on hilly terrain
Makes sense. Kigali is pretty hilly.
to tourism promotion overlays for encouraging that tourist-oriented development in those scenic areas.
Okay, cool.
They're using these overlays to really fine-tune the plan and make sure it addresses the unique characteristics of each part of the city.
This is seriously impressive.
It is.
They're thinking about every angle.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We haven't even gotten into the specific regulations for each zone or those innovative incentives that they've built into the plan.
Okay, I'm officially hooked. Let's dive deeper into those details.
Let's do it.
Okay.
All right, so let's get into some of the specifics of these residential zones.
Right.
Remember how we were talking about Kigali's commitment to being inclusive,
Yeah.
well, this is where it really comes to life.
Okay.
They've created a range of residential zones, each with different density targets and different housing types to really accommodate all those different lifestyles and income levels.
Yeah, makes sense.
So picture this. You're looking for that classic suburban lifestyle with a little bit more space.
Okay.
That's where the R1 zones come in.
R1.
These are the low-density zones, primarily for single-family homes, with a density target of just 10 to 30 dwelling units per hectare.
So not exactly sprawling McMansions, but definitely a bit more room than like your typical city apartment.
Exactly. Now, let's say you prefer a more urban setting, a little bit more hustle and bustle. Okay.
That's where the R4 zones come in.
R4.
These are the high-density zones primarily for apartment buildings with a density target of 160 to 240 dwelling units per hectare.
Wow, that's quite a difference.
Yeah,
So they're really maximizing density in those areas.
exactly.
Sounds like they're trying to create this compact, walkable urban core.
Precisely. But it's not just about density. They've also considered things like building heights.
Okay.
In those R1 low-density zones, the maximum building height is just G plus 2,
G+2.
meaning ground floor plus 2 additional floors.
Okay.
This helps to preserve that sense of openness and scale that's kind of characteristic of those suburban areas.
So they're keeping things relatively low-rise in those more suburban-style zones.
Right. What about those high-density R4 zones?
Yeah, what's going on there?
Well, in the R4 zones, the sky's the limit, at least according to the master plan.
Oh, wow.
They haven't actually specified a maximum building height for those areas,
Interesting.
which means we could see some pretty impressive high-rises popping up in those zones. Yeah, they're really embracing verticality as a way to accommodate all that growth while still preserving land.
It's like that saying, build up, not out.
Exactly.
And it's not just about how much you build, it's also about how you build.
Right.
And they've paid attention to things like setbacks,
Setbacks.
which is the distance between a building and the property line.
Right. Setbacks can make a big difference in how a street feels.
Absolutely. In those R1 low-density zones, they have a minimum front setback of 3 meters.
Okay.
This creates a sense of spaciousness, allows for those front yards and landscaping, and helps to maintain that suburban character.
So it's all about that visual appeal and sense of space.
Exactly. Now, what about setbacks in those denser R4 zones?
Yeah. What happens there?
Well, as you might expect, the setbacks decrease as the density increases.
Okay.
So in those R4 zones, the minimum front setback is just 1.5 meters.
Okay.
This allows for more buildings on a given plot of land, and it creates that more urban feel with the buildings closer to the street.
So they're adjusting the setbacks to really fit the character of each zone.
Exactly.
It seems like they're really focused on creating this cohesive, well-designed urban environment.
They are, and they've also incorporated some interesting variations for corner plots.
Corner plots.
For instance, in those R4 zones, the minimum side setback on a corner plot is 5 meters.
Okay.
This helps to open up those corners, create a little more visual interest, and it just improves pedestrian circulation.
So they're not just like blindly applying the same rules everywhere.
Yeah.
They're taking into account that specific context of each site. It's like
Exactly.
they're tailoring those regulations to fit the city rather than forcing the city to fit the regulations.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so let's talk about parking.
Oh, yeah.
This is always a hot topic in urban planning.
Always.
And Kigali's master plan seems to take this really nuanced approach.
It does.
So I'm curious, how do they actually handle parking in all these different residential zones?
Well, they recognize that parking needs are going to vary depending on the density and the character of each zone.
Okay.
So in those R1 low-density zones where most people have their own garages or driveways, they don't mandate a ton of parking spaces.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you have a garage, you probably don't need a bunch of on-street parking.
Exactly. But in those denser R4 zones, they encourage a mix of on-street parking, shared parking facilities, and even off-street public parking lots.
Okay.
So they're trying to provide enough parking to meet the needs of residents and visitors, but without encouraging too much car dependence.
Yeah, it's a balancing act.
It is. They want to make sure people can get around, but they also want to discourage that car-centric lifestyle.
Exactly.
And to further incentivize using public transportation, they've even incorporated these parking derogations for developments that are located within 500 meters of the bus rapid transit system.
Parking derogations.
Yeah.
So if I'm living near a BRT station, I might not need as many parking spaces.
Exactly. It's a clever way to encourage people to use public transit and reduce that reliance on cars.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
Good.
They're really trying to create a city that's designed for people, not just for cars.
Absolutely. Now let's shift gears from residential to commercial.
Okay.
Remember those mixed-use zones we were talking about?
Yeah, the ones that foster those vibrant live work-play environments.
Exactly.
Love those.
Well, the C1 zones are where those really come to life.
Okay. Mixed-use zones. Tell me more.
In C1 zones, they allow for a mix of residential and commercial uses up to G+4 floors, with the possibility of even adding more floors in some specific locations.
Wow.
So you could have shops, restaurants, offices, and apartments all within the same building or block.
That's the kind of urban environment I love.
Me too.
It's all about creating that 24/7 energy, that sense of community.
Exactly. And they've set some interesting regulations to make sure that these mixed-use developments are really well integrated into the surrounding environment.
Okay, like what?
Well, for example, parking is typically located at the rear of the plot to avoid dominating that street frontage.
Oh, that's smart.
So it prioritizes that pedestrian experience
It's
and
sorry.
makes those ground floor commercial spaces a lot more inviting.
I like it.
And they've also mandated at least 10% landscaping coverage,
Sure.
just to make sure these developments have a little bit of greenery, a more pleasant feel.
It's about creating those high-quality urban spaces that
Yeah.
people actually want to spend time in.
Exactly. Now, in addition to those general C1 regulations,
Right.
they have this special overlay zone called the Neighborhood Commercial Zone Overlay,
Ooh, another overlay.
or OC2 for short.
OC2, got it.
This overlay applies to mixed-use developments that are within residential zones.
Okay.
And it's really all about providing those everyday amenities within walking distance of those residential areas.
Yeah, so this is where those corner stores and those small businesses come into play.
Exactly. And they've set some specific rules for these OC2 developments.
Like?
For example, they're only allowed within a 30-meter buffer from those minor arterials and collector roads.
Okay.
This ensures that they're strategically placed to serve the needs of that neighborhood
Yeah.
without overwhelming that residential character.
So finding that sweet spot between convenience and maintaining the character of the neighborhood.
Precisely. And to add a little bit of flexibility, they actually allow for an additional floor in certain residential zones if those mixed-use developments meet some specific conditions.
Oh, interesting.
So they're willing to bend the rules a little bit to encourage these types of developments, but they're still maintaining that control over the overall density and scale.
Okay, so it's a balanced approach.
It is.
They're encouraging the mixed use, but also making sure that it fits within the context of the neighborhood.
Exactly. Now, beyond those neighborhood scale commercial zones,
Okay.
they also have C3 zones, which are designated as city commercial zones.
City commercial zone.
And these are meant for those larger scale commercial developments, like those major commercial hubs that serve the whole city or even the region.
So like shopping malls, office towers, big entertainment venues.
You got it. And in those C3 zones, they're really going for density and verticality.
How so?
They allow a maximum building height of G+10.
D+10. So we're talking some serious high rises.
Serious high-rises, and they have a maximum floor area ratio of 2.4,
And-
meaning you can pack a lot of development onto those plots.
Wow, so they're maximizing the economic potential of those prime locations.
Exactly. It sounds like they're trying to create this really vibrant, bustling commercial core.
Yeah.
But just like with those mixed-use zones, they've paid attention to things like setbacks, landscaping, and pedestrian access to make sure these C3 developments are well integrated into that urban fabric.
Yeah, they don't want to create those isolated car-dependent commercial zones that you see in some of these cities.
Exactly. They're thinking about that whole experience from the pedestrian level all the way up to the skyline.
It's about creating a city that's not just functional, but also beautiful and enjoyable to be in.
Precisely. Now we've covered residential and commercial zones,
Okay.
but there's still so much more to uncover in this master plan.
There is.
Yeah, we have those public facility zones, the
Yeah.
industrial areas,
Uh-huh.
and those fascinating overlay zones that add those extra layers of control.
Okay, I'm ready. Are you ready to dive deeper?
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's talk about those public facilities.
Yes.
You know, a city is more than just homes and businesses.
Oh, absolutely.
It's about the spaces and services that really make a community thrive.
100%.
So how does the Kigali Master Plan handle those essential elements?
Well, they have these dedicated public facilities zones, or PF zones,
Okay,
to make sure that those essential services are strategically located throughout the city.
makes sense.
And it's not just a one-size-fits-all approach either.
Ah.
They've actually broken it down into these subzones to cater to the specific needs of all these different types of facilities.
Okay, so give me some examples. What kind of public facilities are we talking about?
Well, think about education.
Okay.
They have a zone specifically for schools and research institutions called Public Facilities Zone Education and Research, or PF1.
PF1. Got it.
This ensures that schools are conveniently located for students and families and that they have, adequate space to grow and evolve.
So it's not just about putting a school anywhere. It's about being really strategic about that placement.
Exactly.
What about healthcare?
Well, they have Public Facilities Zone Health, or PF2.
Okay.
And this is for hospitals, clinics, all those other health-related services.
They're making sure that healthcare is accessible to everyone
Yes.
and that those facilities have the space they need to actually provide quality care.
Exactly.
Okay, so they're really thinking about the well-being of their citizens from a planning perspective.
Absolutely.
But a city is also about more than just those practical necessities,
Right.
It's about culture. It's about community.
100%.
So how do they address that?
Well, the Kigali Master Plan actually recognizes this, and they have zones like Public Facilities Zone Religious, or PF3,
PF3.
for places of worship, and then Public Facility Zone Cultural Memorial, or PF4,
Oh, okay.
for things like museums, cultural centers, memorials.
Makes sense.
And these zones ensure that there's actually space for spiritual and cultural expression within the city.
Yeah, I love that they're acknowledging the importance of those spaces.
Yeah.
It's about creating a city that's not just functional, but also inspiring,
Right.
enriching.
And they've even thought about those less glamorous but essential services,
Like what?
like cemeteries and crematoria.
Right.
Those fall under Public Facilities Zone Cemetery Crematoria, or PF5. They're thinking about every stage of life.
They are. It's amazing.
From education and healthcare all the way to those final resting places.
They've really considered the full spectrum of human experience.
They really have.
But it's not just about designating those zones, all right?
Right.
What about the design and the integration of those public facilities into the surrounding environment?
That's a great point and a really crucial aspect. They've included regulations and guidelines to make sure that these public facilities are well designed and actually contribute to the overall quality of the city.
Okay.
For example, they have these requirements for pedestrian circulation,
Makes sense.
making sure that those facilities are accessible and safe for people of all abilities.
Right.
They encourage sustainable design principles,
Good.
and they even have guidelines for things like signage and lighting.
So it feels cohesive.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's those little details that make a big difference in how people experience those spaces.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about those industrial zones.
Okay,
Every city needs a solid economic base,
for sure.
and that often means manufacturing and production. But those industrial areas don't always have the best reputation.
No, they don't.
So how does the Kigali Master Plan address those concerns?
Well, they understand that not all industries are created equal.
Right.
So they've taken this very nuanced approach to zoning those areas.
Okay.
So they have light industrial zones, or I1 zones,
I1.
which are meant for non-polluting activities.
Okay.
Things like agricultural processing bakeries, workshops, warehousing.
So the lighter stuff.
Exactly. And those zones are typically located a bit farther away from residential areas.
Yeah, to minimize disruption.
Exactly.
It's about separating those uses that might not be compatible with, living right next door.
Exactly.
No.
Now, what about those heavier industries?
Right. The ones that might generate more noise or pollution.
Yeah, for those, they have general industrial zones, or I2 zones.
I too.
And those are for activities like manufacturing, brewing, steel fabrication, even things like storage of petroleum products.
Okay.
So these require those larger buffer zones to really protect those residential areas from potential impacts.
It's like creating those safety zones to make sure those industries can operate without negatively impacting the people who live nearby.
Exactly.
What about extractive industries,
Like what?
like mining and quarrying?
Oh, yeah. They have a special category for those called mining and quarry industrial zones, or I3 zones.
Yeah.
And these are very carefully regulated to make sure those activities are done sustainably and with minimal environmental impact.
Okay, good to know.
They have some really strict rules in place to manage those operations responsibly.
It's good to know they're not just, turning a blind eye to those potentially impactful industries.
Not at all.
Okay, let's get back to those overlay zones we talked about earlier.
Yes.
You mentioned that they add this extra layer of control to the zoning regulations.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Absolutely. Think of these overlays as a way to fine-tune the plan,
Okay.
addressing very specific issues or opportunities that might not be fully captured by just those basic zone categories.
Give me an example.
Okay, so for example, they have this public facilities overlay.
Okay.
that actually provides guidance on where to put public facilities based on the needs of the population.
So it's a strategic map of where things should go.
Exactly. It's like showing where schools, hospitals, all those other essential services should be located to really best serve the community.
So it's about making sure those services are strategically located and accessible to everyone.
Exactly.
What other overlays do they have?
Well, Kigali's got a lot of hills and valleys.
Right.
So they have this slope overlay to regulate development on those challenging terrains.
Okay, makes sense.
This overlay requires those detailed geotechnical assessments and mitigation measures.
To make sure everything is safe.
Exactly, to ensure safety and environmental protection.
So they're not prohibiting development on slopes, but they're making sure that it's done carefully.
Precisely. What about those areas with tourism potential?
Yeah, how do they handle that?
Well, they have this tourism promotion overlay for those areas,
Okay.
encouraging that tourist-oriented development along those scenic areas like Lake Muhazi.
Oh yeah, beautiful.
This overlay promotes hotels, restaurants, recreational facilities, and other amenities that really cater to visitors.
So they're thinking about economic development as well.
Exactly.
What about preserving Kigali's history and culture?
Great question. They have this heritage conservation and promotion overlay
Okay.
to protect those really valuable historical and cultural sites.
Okay.
This overlay encourages the preservation and adaptive reuse of those sites,
Right.
ensuring that they remain a part of the city's fabric for years to come.
It's great that they're thinking about that long-term cultural heritage of the city.
Absolutely.
Any other overlays you want to highlight?
Well, since Kigali has that international airport,
Right.
they have overlays to manage the development around that,
Okay.
like the obstacle limitation surfaces overlay and the public safety zones overlay.
Makes sense.
These regulate building heights and land uses to ensure the safe operation of the airport.
You don't want any skyscrapers interfering with those flight paths.
Exactly.
What about protecting those environmentally sensitive areas like wetlands and forests?
Well, they have a buffers overlay for that.
Okay.
Establishing these buffer zones around those sensitive features.
Yeah, buffers are so important
They really are.
to protect those natural areas.
Exactly. It sounds like they've really thought of everything.
They even have this natural disaster risk overlay
Wow.
to address those areas that are prone to things like flooding or other natural hazards.
Okay.
This overlay actually restricts development in those high-risk zones
Interesting.
and encourages uses that are compatible with those potential hazards.
So minimizing risk and promoting more resilient development practices.
Exactly.
Wow. This deep dive into the Kigali Master Plan has been incredibly insightful.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It's amazing how they've really gone above and beyond in terms of planning and foresight.
It's truly impressive.
They've managed to weave together economic development, environmental protection,
Social equity.
cultural preservation, all into this one comprehensive and ambitious plan.
It really is a blueprint for a city that's not just functional, but also sustainable, inclusive, and beautiful.
It makes you wonder how other cities measure up.
It does.
Are there any lessons that other urban planners and policymakers can learn from Kigali's approach? I think absolutely the Kigali Master Plan offers a wealth of insights and innovations that can be adapted and applied in other contexts.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that with careful planning and a real commitment to community engagement,
Yeah.
we can create cities that are truly designed for people.
It's really inspiring to see what's possible when you have that kind of vision and dedication.
It is.
This has been an awesome deep dive.
I agree.
Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep imagining those cities of the future.